hammy pie. Oh, that is a precious. But as we grow, we understand, for we look back and see through older eyes and wilder hearts her love and loyalty. Happy 90th birthday, love, hammy pie. Oh, that's precious. Give me a kiss on that. Oh, don't cry. It's precious. Well, it's kind of sweet to cry.
And I just said, Mommy, why me? And we both started crying. And that's when she really gave me the strength of her belief that it's not given to you as punishment. It is a random thing that happens on the planet Earth. People get diseases. And that we're just going to do everything we can with all the operations that I had to get me better, all the swimming, to handle it beautifully. But there's no reason, there's no answer to why me. But don't feel like it was directed at me, because it was not. It was a chance occurrence. And we cried and hugged, and I never asked that question again. My question was answered.
It is the story of a life measured not in time, but in challenges transformed into triumphs. From a baby girl afflicted with a terrible disease to a symbol of hope for millions. A respected broadcast journalist who broke barriers and defied stereotypes. And a tireless advocate for those with physical disabilities.
In 1952, which is the year after I got polio, in the United States there were 58,000 cases of polio. By 1961, after the introduction and big campaigns for the Salk vaccine, there were 2,100 cases. And by 1999, there were 0. And there hasn't been a case of polio in the United States since then.
Pam Henry was only 14 months old when the course of her life was forever changed. She and her family were not alone. Polio was still a fearful reality in 1951.
The situation was dire in communities that were affected by polio to the tune of tens or dozens or hundreds of children. Right, public swimming pools would be closed, movie theaters would be closed. Sometimes a small town would actually shut down during the polio season, which was roughly mid-July into September in the hottest months of the summer when cases of polio peaked in the United States.
But for Pam, growing up in Oklahoma City, in a happy home with her brother and devoted mother and father, the disease was less a limitation than a matter-of-fact condition of her life.
But I didn't think I was different in a bad way. I just knew that I had braces and crutches and the other children didn't. But they were always so sweet to me, and they included me in anything I could do. And we would play kickball in the neighborhood, and I was good at kickball. I mean, with my right leg was strong and I could kick that ball. And then I could run on my crutches, not as fast as the other kids, but they probably didn't try to put me out as much as some of the kids. But so I did a lot of things, and I was the best swimmer of anyone I knew. I would get on the swing set at recess, and the kids would borrow my crutches and run all over the playground with them. They thought it was fun. So the kids were very nice to me, and I never did run into any cruelty. As an older person, I'd be in a grocery store, and a child would come up and say, invariably the same question, "What happened to you?" And the mother would just die of embarrassment. And I'd say, no, that's okay. Intelligent children are the ones who ask that question. And I would explain to them about polio and how the crutches helped me walk, and that if they had their polio shot or cube of sugar, they didn't need to worry about getting it. And that made the child happy, and the mother revived herself.
The fight to eradicate polio got a very substantial boost little more than a decade before Pam's birth from this man, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR had contracted polio, also known as infantile paralysis, in 1921 at the age of 39. Against formidable odds, Roosevelt would become president and helped to create the organization known today as the March of Dimes.
The founder was Franklin Roosevelt, who was a president of the United States at that time, and he was the only person in the history of the world to be elected to be leader of his country, and he could not walk or stand on his own. That was a remarkable fact to begin with. He had actually founded a polio rehabilitation center in Warm Springs, Georgia, before this, in the mid-1920s. It was called the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. And while it was successful, it really couldn't deal nationally with the problem of polio to really eradicate polio at its root. So there was a presidential proclamation in 1937 in which he announced the founding of this organization. And from 1938, it led the way to really defeat polio within a matter of 20 years or so.
Roosevelt used the occasion of his birthday each year, January 30th, to host a celebration to benefit polio research. On radio, he appealed to Americans to send their dimes, or whatever they could afford, to the White House to help fund research.
Tonight, because of your splendid help, we are making it possible to unite all the forces against one of these plagues by starting the work of the new National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. The dollars and the dimes contributed tonight and in the continuing campaign will be turned over to this new foundation, which will marshal its forces for the amelioration of suffering and crippling among infantile paralysis victims wherever they are found.
And America responded, inundating the White House with dimes, dollars, and hope for a future free of the dreaded disease.
And in all the envelopes are dimes and quarters and even dollar bills, gifts from grown-ups and children, mostly from children who want to help other children to get well.
It was popular comedian Eddie Cantor who would ultimately coin the phrase March of Dimes in a radio appeal, and the name would remain.
Mother, can you spare a dime?
With the death of President Roosevelt in 1945, the Foundation for Infantile Paralysis lost its best spokesman and fundraiser. The group decided to use another approach to keep its message before the public. Young victims of the disease would be recruited to be the living human symbols of polio. They would become poster children.
We created these posters beginning in 1946, and I imagine that these children, all of whom who had polio and all who were depicted fairly naturally in some stage of recovery, were little Franklin Roosevelts, that we were impressing the public that this disease wasn't going away. We still needed to try to find a means to eradicate it, and it became very successful.
The public awareness and fundraising power of the poster children had tangible results, helping to finance the research of Dr. Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine. An additional vaccine that could be taken orally, created by Dr. Albert Sabin, would follow. But both were too late for Pam. The Salk vaccine had been so successful that by the time the March of Dimes planned its 1959 campaign, the organization was ready to expand its focus beyond polio.
We were representing 3 diseases in 1959, polio, arthritis, and birth defects, and we branded that campaign as the 3 faces of crippling, trying to show the disabling effects of those 3 diseases, and that's where Pam Henry came in. So she was the person who represented polio because that was still on our plate. We still had, at that point in time, about 50,000 polio cases in rehabilitation, in hospitals, in homes throughout the United States that we were supplying patient aid for. So that didn't go away simply because there was a vaccine. We were still pursuing education to educate the public about vaccination, and also supporting the work of Albert Sabin, who made a live virus polio vaccine that was licensed in 1962.
So this was the first year, 1959 was the first year they were going to have that expanded goal. And the posters were going to be a young boy with birth defects and me, both on the poster. And they were going to have more public appearances and more commercials, more interviews, and they wanted an older child instead of a precious little 5-year-old. They wanted an 8-year-old who could actually answer questions and talk to people. And they thought, is Pammy still interested, and are you as her parents still interested in her being poster child? And my parents talked about it and they said yes. They knew I would miss a lot of school, but they knew that the education I would get from traveling the country and meeting fabulous people would be well worth it, and I could make up my school later.
The National Foundation launches its expanded program for 1959. 3 poster children represent the 3 faces of crippling for the March of Dimes against arthritis and birth defects, as well as polio. Arthritic Doreen Keisha of Cleveland, Pamela Henry of Oklahoma City, the polio girl, and Jeffrey Ryle of New York, born with a twisted spine. The National Foundation seeks to raise $65 million to win victories beyond polio.
In January of 1959, Pam and her mother set out on an exhausting cross-country promotional tour on behalf of the March of Dimes. For the millions of people who would see her on billboards, in newspapers, and on television, Pam Henry now was the national symbol of a disease that had terrified the country. But for Pam, the publicity blitz also became an extraordinary opportunity to meet some of the most important, famous, and glamorous people of the era.
I was extremely excited to meet Mamie Eisenhower, the First Lady in the White House. She was charming, and we had just gone to the Smithsonian the day before and seen all of the inaugural gowns of the First Ladies. And hers was beautiful pink lace with a big full skirt, and I couldn't wait to tell her about that. And Mother was glad that that was what I talked about. I met this very handsome young senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy. And he was so nice and gave me a model of a rocket from NASA that I kept for years and years. And as we left, my mother said, "What a head of hair that gentleman has." And then I met Tony Curtis. And I didn't know who Tony Curtis was. I hadn't seen enough movies or identified him. But he was the most handsome, charming man I had ever met in my life. And I fell in love with Tony Curtis. And the picture that we took, I was always supposed to hold my March of Dimes button right here in front of the celebrity and look straight into the camera and smile. But in the Tony Curtis picture, I'm going, Lena Horne was performing on Broadway, and we were backstage, and Mother was combing my hair, and I was blonde then. And Mother said, "Mrs. Horne, I'm sorry to bother you, but do you have a bobby pin?" Pam's hair's falling down in her face. And Mother said, "Oh, here's one. May I use this?" And Miss Horne said, "Oh, don't use that one. It was a black bobby pin." She said, "Here's a blonde one." And she had a blonde bobby pin and gave me that for my hair. And I thought that was the most considerate thing.
Among the celebrities Pam would meet along her journey, 2 would foreshadow her coming career and be lifelong influences: Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite.
But when you were in a room with him, you paid attention to what he said. And he was so nice. He sat there with a cigarette, which no one in this day and age would be allowed to do around an 8-year-old, but that was the day and age. And he later died of lung cancer, but our picture together, he's holding a cigarette. And he said, I'd like to give you an album. And he gave me an album of jazz music. And he said, do you like jazz? And I said, no, sir. And Mother just cringed. And he said, then let me get you another album. And he pulled out an album of the greatest sound recordings in the history of the world, including Eleanor Roosevelt speaking at the United Nations, the radio announcer when the Hindenburg burned up, Oh, the Humanity. One of the greatest albums ever produced, and I was always so glad I told him I didn't like jazz. And he had a big map of the world in back of his desk in those days. That was the scenery of his studio. And I said, I know what that map's for. And he said, oh, do you? And I said, yes. And I took my crutch and I went up and I did a weather forecast. Because everyone in Oklahoma knows if you have a big map, you're talking about the weather. And he laughed and laughed. And he was so nice to me. And years later, when I got a job at KTOK Radio, I wrote him a letter and said he was so nice to me and I was so impressed with him and his career that it pointed me to go into news. And he wrote me back. And he wrote, I remember you and congratulations. And if I can ever be of any help, if I may ever be of any help, let me know. And he said, I remember you because you had remarkable aplomb. And I had to look up the word aplomb, but it was a compliment.
It wasn't always glamorous. Nearing the end of the tour, Pam and her mother visited Hyde Park, New York, and Springwood, the family home of her beloved Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There they would meet Eleanor Roosevelt, but not before the excitement and exhaustion of the trip finally took their toll on the otherwise very composed young girl.
I walked into the most beautiful home you've ever seen. I mean, this is a museum quality home. And I threw up on her carpet. Fortunately, I did it right off the bat before she was in the room. And her staff was so sweet and so good. They were out there like that, had it cleaned up like that. Nothing showed. It was just all clean. And then they went to get Mrs. Roosevelt, and not one word was ever said about that.
Later, Pam and Mrs. Roosevelt and one of the other poster children would pay a memorable visit to FDR's gravesite in the Rose Garden just outside Springwood.
So what Pam Henry did was really she was, I suppose, sealing the end of that story and providing some closure to that public story about children who had polio and what their lives were like after they were disabled.
She would be the last child to represent the disease of polio in a March of Dimes poster and campaign. Now it was time to go home to Oklahoma. But Pam's life, influence, and accomplishment were just beginning. By the time Pam Henry graduated from Oklahoma City's John Marshall High School in 1968, her career path was already firmly set.
And then I told my parents I wanted to go to OU and major in speech broadcasting. They told me, well, Pam, we want you to go to wherever you want to go to college and major in whatever you want to major in, but we can't afford to send you to college for 4 years and have you come out and not be able to get a job. And I said, oh, but I will. I made an appointment with the head of the department, Dr. Ressler at OU, and my parents went down with me. And he convinced me that although there were no women in TV news at that time, by the time I graduated, there would be.
She began working at radio while still a student at the University of Oklahoma, first at the campus station, KGOU, then as an unpaid intern at KTOK Radio, where her perseverance and skills landed her a staff position. she would be the first woman in the all-male news department.
I was greeted by all but 2 of the newsmen. They'd never worked with a woman in a newsroom before. This was very, very new. And 2 of them didn't like the idea at all. And the others were just thrilled to death that I was going to be there. So I just tried to be really nice and work really hard and be very polite to the ones who had said they didn't want me there. And I was extra careful to make sure that messages from their wives always got to them. I didn't want their wives at home saying, "I don't like having that woman in your newsroom."
I first met Pam Henry in the middle of a 3-alarm fire. She came wading through 3 feet of water on crutches, holding a microphone between her teeth. We'd been looking to hire a woman at Channel 4, despite the grumbling of all the guys in the newsroom. And I went in the next morning to the news director, Ernie Schultz, and I said, "Hey, Ernie, I think we found her."
And I'm just amazed at the get up and go that she had, and the condition that she was in at the time. Was there nothing going to stop her? Did nobody stop her, anything? She's just a go-getter. That's what I remember about Pam the first time I saw her.
And as much as I loved my job at KTOK, when I saw the impact of a television news report, and especially a television news series, I thought, now that's the way to tell a story.
Soon thereafter, Pam interviewed for a job at WKY-TV.
We talked about everything from, I told them, I thought it was only proper to tell them that there were a few things I couldn't do, like carry big boxes of videotape up a flight of stairs. When I was going upstairs, I needed my crutches. I said, other than that, I can do anything. And I said something that served me well later on. I said, if I ever need any help, I'll ask for it. And if I don't ask for it, I don't need help.
She was hired. Once again, the first woman in an all-male newsroom. While most of the staff welcomed the news, the sentiment was not universal.
And Tom said, we already have a black. Why do we need a woman? Well, on 2 counts then, that reporter made everyone in the newsroom furious. And they all just mentally clicked, I'm for Pam, I'm for Pam, I'm for Pam. So he really did me a favor by saying that. And when I heard about it later, I thought, well, that's the way it goes.
I thought about it a couple of 2 or 3 hours later. You know, I just got through voting for the first female woman to come to work at a TV station in the state of Oklahoma. I wonder what they did when they was getting ready to hire me. Did they have the same type of a vote? And that's always struck me in my mind is, you know, how ironic. 2 of the first at the same station.
But in a matter of months, Pam had established her competency as a television journalist and began anchoring in addition to reporting. Her determination and strength of will had a lasting impact on her coworkers.
Working in television is a little like riding on smoke. It soon drifts away, but the significant people we meet linger. The thing about Pam Henry was that she just showed up and did her job and then made it special. And by watching her do what she did, I realized that really is a blueprint for my life too.
I don't care if you had to go out here and track somebody down in the woods with a local sheriff department, you know, some escapee or anything. Pam was going to be right there. Did nothing hold her back. Absolutely nothing. I mean, Pam could shoot. And at that time, when we got hired, you had to know how to write stories, you had to know how to edit the story, you want to learn how to edit the story and how to shoot the story. Pam could shoot just as good as any man could shoot. One of the best reporters I've ever met in my life. She's a great, great, great writer. Oh, she could write, you know. And it wasn't no, well, let's help her get in the car, get out of the car and all that. You just got out of her way, and that was all there was to it. Pam was there before you were most of the time. That's the bottom line.
So Pam came over and asked me if I needed to be introduced to anyone, if I had any questions about anything going on in the governor's mansion and this press event. She was the only person that talked to me, and that was the first time I met her and the first time I recognized that she had a disability. And I told her I would help her down the steps. This was upstairs at the governor's mansion, and it was before an elevator was available, so she had to go up the stairs, which for most of us was not a big deal. But for Pam, it was a struggle to get up and down the stairs. I asked her if she needed some help, and in typical Pam way, she said no thanks. She was okay.
Still, it was the 1970s, and for all of her demonstrated skills, the attitudes of that era sometimes prevailed.
The day of the McAllister prison riot, I wanted to go, but our senior reporter and photographer were sent. And I got sent to a bake sale in Shawnee. I was mortified, but when Ernie gave you an assignment, you said, "Thank you, sir," and went out the door. So here we were driving down to this bake sale that was for some women's issue. I mean, it was newsworthy, but we were driving down, and of course those WKY cars were painted like circus wagons, and the highway patrol was zooming past us on I-40 going down to McAllister. And when they'd see us, they knew we were news, and they just said, "Come on." It was like, it was okay to speed. We know where you're going. And I thought, oh, if only. And we turned off in Shawnee, and I covered my bake sale.
Ultimately, Pam would focus on covering state government at WKY-TV, bringing a strict code of fairness to the job, along with a disarming ability to gain the trust and admiration of almost everyone she met.
At KTOK Radio, I learned to get it right and to get it fast. And those were the two main principles. When I went to Channel 4, everything was to get both sides of the story. We cleared our assignments with Ernie or Jack. Usually it was Ernie because he was there in the morning. Jack did the 6 and 10 o'clock p.m. news. And we weren't to go out the door unless we had both sides of an issue set up, because it wasn't a story unless you had both sides. And that was probably the best lesson in journalism I ever learned. Don't even go out the door if you don't have both sides. Just keep working until you can get a good balance.
She's always been a person that stood up for the people. You know, it didn't care whether you were a politician, whether you were the chief of police or anything. She was reporting for the person, so the person out there on the street could understand exactly what was getting ready to happen to them. So, and that's the way I felt about it too, and that's how we started working together.
She was just so gracious, and she was one of those people who managed to maintain her courtesy and her graciousness in a business that is frequently anything but that is full of a lot of really hard-charging, hard-talking, hard-living people. And she was always, and I know it's an outdated notion, but she was always a lady and a professional, and had the respect of a lot of people for having been a pioneer in the industry.
But journalism would, for a time, be set aside for politics. In 1976, Pam had married David Holliday, an aide to Oklahoma Governor David Boren. Boren was elected to the United States Senate in 1978, and David Holliday would go with the freshman senator to Washington. Unable to get a broadcast reporting job in the Capitol, "Your accent is too Southern," the news director said. Pam found staff work on the Hill.
So I worked for FEMA in public information, and then I worked for Congressman Wes Watkins, and I learned so much working on Capitol Hill. It made me a better news person when I moved home.
But the move back home to Oklahoma would be bittersweet, and without her husband.
We just started going our separate ways even while we were in Washington. And when I got the job offer from Channel 9, my husband checked into a couple of jobs, good jobs, in Oklahoma City and did not get them. And he knew that his best career was to stay in Washington. And so we just went our separate ways because of our careers, which were so central to both of our personalities.
Pam threw herself back into the world of journalism at Oklahoma City's KWTV. She loved the work, but the emotional stress of ending the marriage and the lingering effects of her childhood polio were taking a toll.
I just got to where I think I was starting to feel bad. I didn't know it at the time, but I think physically my strength was going because I was getting older. And I had been divorced and I was by myself most of the time. And I started drinking at home alone, and that is not good. And then I got to where I went to AA meetings for about 3 years and said, I'm Pam Henry, I'm an alcoholic.
Pam's passion for reporting the news would continue to impress both viewers and coworkers over the next few years.
But I walked into the newsroom on my day off to get my paycheck in a day when there wasn't electronic deposits. And I noticed immediately something was amiss in the newsroom. The newsroom was abuzz, no one was sitting down, everyone was running around. It was obvious there was something going on of significance. And I couldn't find anybody that would stop and talk to me so I could figure out what was going on. So I simply turned up the monitor because we were on the air. And it was Pam who was breaking into regular programming to describe the incredible, unfortunate scene at the Star School Elementary School where a boiler had exploded and injured and killed some kids and some employees at the school building. But Pam's interest in serious journalism was apparent on that day, and I think something her fans appreciated all of her journalistic career.
So let's check in now with Pam Henry and House races, Pam.
All right, thank you very much. I'm here with Larry Warden, Chief Administrator of the State House of Representatives, and we have a number, if not most, of the races decided by now.
In 1986, Pam arrived at the Oklahoma Educational Television Authority. With its statewide reach and strong focus on state government news, OETA would be her happy journalistic home for the next 16 years, most of them as Manager of News and Public Affairs.
Pam was a really good person to work for because as a reporter she understood what was going on. I think she set the tone for the news department, not only the kinds of stories that we would do, but the quality of the stories. So it was great to have Pam as news director leading the news operation because she had been there and done that, and we could appreciate that.
I didn't even know that she'd had polio, didn't know the backstory at all. I knew she had some sort of disability, but it was a secondary thing. You just didn't notice it that much because by the time I met her, she was a giant in the industry, she was a legend in the industry, she was the news director, and she was a gracious lady. And so all of that, I think, transcended any limitations that people might have tried to put on her because of her disability.
And I learned more on Capitol Hill that helped me be a good reporter and news director here at OETA because I could cover Congress from afar. And OETA doesn't have money to send a reporter to Washington or to even hire a crew in Washington. So I would call all of the press secretaries for our congressional delegation and say, hi, this is Pam, you know, OETA is very poor. So whenever your office holder is going to get up and give a speech, let me know and I'll tape it on C-SPAN. And so one of my fondest memories, I was already in my wheelchair at the time, is rolling around OETA at full speed looking for one of the engineers to say, I need you on C-SPAN 1 right away.
They were good years. No one worked harder, her staff observed, or enjoyed the work more than Pam Henry. It almost seemed that the former polio poster child was invincible.
And then in June of 2001, I was getting ready to go home, and I always went to the restroom before I drove home because it was a 30-minute drive. And I don't remember the next 2 weeks. I collapsed in the bathroom, and thank the Lord, or whatever angel told the personnel director to check the bathroom. She had never done it before, but she was getting ready to go home on a Friday afternoon, and she thought, I'm going to check the bathroom. And she did, and I was there lying on the floor, pretty incoherent. And so they took me to the hospital, and I had a brain aneurysm and had emergency surgery that next morning.
Well, it's been a bittersweet day here at the Oklahoma News Report as we say goodbye to a respected colleague and a very dear friend. Pam Henry has served as OETA's news director for the last 11 years, in addition to hosting Oklahoma Magazine and coordinating our election coverage. Pam retired today, ending a 30-year career as a true television pioneer.
And I was trying to do in 20 hours what I had done in 50 hours. And guess what? It didn't work. So they told me that I needed to retire, and if I retired, I could retire on disability. And I did not want to go on disability, and I don't mean a little tear went down my face. I mean, I went, Rah! They had to calm me down and send me home. But eventually I did have to retire due to my health.
Pam and her contemporaries opened the door for women in local market news, or perhaps we should say, kicked the door in, because at the time there were very few women working in television, period. We've enjoyed her company and appreciated her insight and experience, so it's with a touch of sadness that we say so long, thank you, and have a very happy retirement, Pam. She truly is a pioneer.
No kidding.
And in the retirement process, I thought, well, I never got in the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame. That's too bad. That's something I missed out on. I was sitting at home about a year after my retirement. I retired in May of 2002. In about May of 2003, I had an email from Dr. Terry Clark at the University of Central Oklahoma. And he is a journalism professor, but he's also in charge of the Journalism Hall of Fame. And he said, please call me. And it had daytime and a nighttime number, and this was at night when I was checking my emails. I called him, and he told me I'd been selected for the Journalism Hall of Fame. And I think that was the happiest I have ever been about an award, because that was for your career of work, the body of work that you did.
She stood out as such a giant and a force within Oklahoma journalism, so well known, so influential, that really was no question at all. We thought, why haven't we inducted her before? She's quite the person and quite the journalist, and all of her accomplishments just leaped off the board.
Pam was able to do something that a lot of people can't do very well, and that is, after she got out of the day-to-day news operation, got out of journalism, she created another life for herself. And I think one of the things that stands out in my mind is that Pam continues to be a champion for people who have obstacles in front of them.
The daily grind of the newsroom behind her, Pam now turned to changing facts instead of just reporting them. Her venue was no longer a television studio, but committee rooms at the state capitol and at City Hall, and any place else she could get an audience.
I'm proud of my career. I wanted to be a newswoman when there were no women newscasters, and I was able to accomplish that. But I'm also proud of my work before I retired, and especially now that I am retired, on volunteer work for disability causes. I'm so glad that I can use my visibility, my ability to write press releases, my ability to speak, to help other people with disabilities. We're getting ready to get the press release out, the news release out on nominations for awards for 2015.
Pam's service on behalf of others with disabilities was already well established as a longtime member of the Oklahoma City Mayor's Committee on Disability Concerns. Now she would assume leadership of that body.
In a couple of conversations with her, I realized she was the right person to represent me and my interest on this committee. And when I approached her about it, she seemed flattered, but unsure, I think, if she was really the right person for it. And I insisted that I wasn't considering anybody else. And from that point on, she never looked back, and she took that committee to heights it had never experienced before.
Our committee is focused on sidewalks. Every bus in Oklahoma City is handicap accessible. A wheelchair can get on any city bus and go to work. But if you can't get to the bus stop, if there's no sidewalk to the bus stop and you have to go down Northwest Expressway, forget it. You cannot go down Northwest Expressway in a wheelchair. It's too dangerous.
I think a lot of Pam's work was helping to inspire the private sector to get involved in disability concerns and awareness. And she's been specifically involved in the sidewalk construction that we've had in Oklahoma City. We're building hundreds of miles of new sidewalks, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of citizen oversight that takes place along the way, and Pam has spearheaded those efforts.
The biggest change for people with disabilities in the last few decades was the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And of course, people ask me if the ADA made it much easier for me to function. Yes, it did. But the biggest change was when I moved home from Washington, D.C. to Oklahoma City, because Oklahoma City had parking spaces for my car. So we would love to get the home builders to work with us to make homes universal design. And that works for everybody, because everybody gets older. And the baby boomers are getting older en masse. And so many people need an accessible home at some point, even if it's just for a year or for a few months.
And attitudes can still pose challenges every bit as big as any physical barrier.
The attitudinal barriers that still exist are some employers don't want to hire an employee with a disability. They think they'll be a problem or sick more often, when in fact they're getting the most loyal employee they could ever get, because this person wants a job and sees it as a blessing. There's no 9 to 5 with a handicapped person. They want to go to work. They want to be independent. Thursday, January 8, 2015, The Oklahoman, Staff Editorial Number 2. Keystone veto would put fringe ahead of U.S. jobs. The new Republican Congress is sworn in and ready to work.
The fact that Pam has been involved in various activities that help people that do have challenges says a lot about her. She was able to move beyond being a journalist and be an advocate, which is not easy, but she's become a great advocate for people with various life challenges. And I think that says a lot about Pam Henry.
Polio poster child, pioneering broadcast journalist, tireless advocate for the disabled, a life rich in achievement and tempered by challenges, a life that has touched and enriched countless others.
I think any difficulty you go through, it either kills you or makes you stronger, and I'm still here. So combating too much alcohol and combating the polio, both have made me stronger.
I do think that those polio survivors, in my experience, are just really extraordinarily tough people. And they're circumspect, and they have this beautiful view of life, I think, from having gone through that as children and the difficulty. And so often you find that young people who've had to overcome difficulties at an early age become just extraordinary human beings. And certainly Pam is one of those. My father-in-law is like that after having overcome polio in his youth. And I think that we can learn from that struggle, what it made them and how it made them better. And I think it's great for young people to find out what that was all about and how it changed a generation. And so I think the whole overall lesson of Pam Henry's life is great. It's a history lesson, it's a personality lesson, it's a leadership lesson, and it's just a great story, and I'm glad it's been told.
She just would not let anybody tell her she couldn't do something. And thus she becomes a huge role model for people today. My students, for example, I've had her in to talk to them, and they get wide-eyed realizing what she's gone through, and inspired, because then they know, here's an example we can follow.
She was a perfect next-door little girl. Daughter, sister, mother, any way you want to put it, she was Pam. And if you've been around her for any length of time, you know exactly what I mean. Pam was just going to be her sweet, loving, beautiful self.
Whether she was in a television newsroom or at City Hall, she's held her own at every step of the way. And And yeah, maybe she has to work a little bit harder than everybody else, but if she does, she's doing it gladly. And she seems to me to be a godly person who cherishes each day just like everybody else.
Pam and I both had polio, and she reminds me of that little childhood book, The Little Engine That Could. I think I can, I think I can, I know I can. She huffed and puffed her way to the top, and she showed us that anything was possible despite significant challenges and all kinds of problems that you might have.
This woman has just about done everything and has such a force of will. On top of that, she's got this great personality and smile. You know, you're just always glad to see Pam Henry, and you're really proud that she is your friend.
But Pam was, I tell you, that's my woman, that's my girl. That's one of the best friends a man could have.
Hang in there and just do what you can where you are with what you have. And you will find that it's an amazing array of possibilities.